American national government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 6, Interest Groups. In this segment, we'll be considering the learning objective of identifying the role interest groups play within our political system. Now, to understand interest groups, we have to understand what they are as well as what sort of system they function in. And pluralist theory helps us out with the second aspect of this. So the first thing we're going to do is, define what interest groups are. So, interest groups are organizations of people who share a common concern or value, and they engage in collective action to make demands on others in society concerning those interests. So they have two objectives, and the first is to seek new benefits that promote their group's interest. And tied with this is the second objective, which is to defend current benefits to protect their group's interests. So it's both positive and negative. First of all, to obtain what you can, and then secondly, to protect what you have from others that might take that away from you. Now, when we consider the system in which interest groups function, we give it the definition of pluralism. And the basic idea here is that you have multiple different conflicting interest groups. They're responding to the shared attitudes of members that belong to these interest groups, and they provide access through the groups to government officials while competing with one another to influence policy decisions. So let's take a look at some of the basic attributes of this pluralistic theory and the system within which it is describing. First, citizens do not directly participate in decision making. Instead, they rely on their leaders to make decisions through bargaining, accommodation, and compromise. So a lot of behind-the-scenes activities. Secondly, there's competition amongst the interest groups, and what this does is it helps protect individuals' interests by providing a check on other groups. So while you might not be winning all the time, you're at least winning part of the time and possibly, hopefully, not losing all the time. Now, thirdly, elections influence policy by choosing competing elites. So the interest groups can certainly have an influence on that, as we'll see later on. Now, fourth, we see that individuals do not directly exert influence, but they exert influence by participating in groups. And this is one of the things that politics understands. Individuals aren't segmented. They work best in groups. And interest groups, those factions, are an important part of the American political system, indeed all political systems. So moving on with the basic attributes of pluralism, we see that these leadership groups or interest groups are open and new ones can form at any time. So while you have political influences unequally distributed, and certainly there are going to be groups that have substantially more political power, the power itself is widely dispersed, so there's no one winner or loser. So there are multiple interest groups that operate within society, and as a result, no single elite dominates decision-making in all issues. So ultimately, what we're seeing here is that public policy is the balance of interest group interaction. Well, it does not reflect majority preference. It does provide for competing interest groups. So let's take a look at what the promise of interest groups is. First of all, we have the core democratic principle of political freedom. So while we're not supporting the core principle of majority rule, we are supporting the core democratic principle of political freedom, which is something that the anti-federalists were very concerned about and were responded to by the Federalists in the Federalist Papers, especially Federalist Paper number 10 and number 51, and then seen in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. And to take a quote here from the First Amendment, "The right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances covers this idea here. And one of the means by which they assemble as a group and then petition is through interest groups." And of course, the basic underlying concept here that the Federalist Papers understood is that, well, humans aren't angels. and you're not going to get a perfect political system. In other words, humans are ambitious creatures, but ambition can be made to counteract ambition of others. So that's the idea of interest groups, is that if you have competing groups, you will not have a system in which one group, one individual controls everything. So, to summarize, using Federalist 51 as the example, at least the highlight of what the Federalist Papers were trying to convince the colonists of, and of which the Founding Fathers took very much into account, this is what they said. It is of great importance in a republic not only to guard the society against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of society against the injustice of the other part. Different interests necessarily exist in different classes of citizens. If a majority be united by a common interest, the rights of the minority will be insecure. There are but two methods of providing against this evil. The one, by creating a will in the community independent of the majority, that is, of the society itself. The other, by comprehending in the society so many separate descriptions of citizens as will render an unjust combination of a majority of the whole very improbable, if not impracticable. So, in conclusion, what we see here is that our Founding Fathers understood that factions or interest groups would come about, but they are a necessary evil for the functioning of a democratic system that, while it is not perfect, functions rather effectively and has been very successful over the over 200 years that this nation has been in existence. American national government.